On April 20th, Abdu'l-Baha traveled to Washington, D.C. Newspaper columnist Elbert Hubbard reported,
"A very great man has recently visited America. Out of Persia comes Abdu'l-Baha, who calls himself the servant of God. This man is the modern Messiah. He meets all classes and kinds of people. Let him visit any bank, factory, office building, church, and everything is laid aside, and eyes bulge and ears listen until he takes his departure."
Agnes Parsons, the daughter of a military officer who had fought under General Custer, married into wealth and with a circle of prominent friends, had made a pilgrimage to Akka in 1910. She created a Georgian-style home with a room that could hold 150 people. During his first visit to Washington, he stayed in her home, and on subsequent visits, he held meetings there regularly. She introduced Abdu'l-Baha to politicians, artists, writers, and professors in large and small gatherings around the city. On April 26th, he entertained numerous visitors, including the U.S. Treasurer Lee McClung, who later recalled,
"I felt as if I were in the presence of a great prophet. Isaiah, Elijah. No, that's not it. The presence of Christ. No. I felt as if I were in the presence of my divine Father."
He addressed capacity crowds at President Taft's All Saints Unitarian Church and the prestigious Continental Hall of the Daughters of the American Revolution, sharing the platform with reformers like Samuel Gompers and DAR President Julia Green Scott. Before an audience of 3,000, including young suffragette women, he spoke on the importance of women's rights and received a standing ovation.
One of the teachings of Baha'u'llah is equality of rights for men and women. When he promulgated this principle in the Orient, the people were astonished. One of the proofs of the advancement of women is this magnificent building and this large gathering.
When he spoke of the necessity of giving women the same training as men, applause was thunderous. One newspaper had reported,
Abdu'l-Baha, leader of the Baha'i movement, in his last public address in this city, last night at the Memorial Continental Hall, made a plea for the equality of man and woman.
He thoroughly enjoyed the sights of the Capitol, touring the statuary and paintings of the Capitol building, and enjoying the view from the top of the Washington Monument. One night, he toured Washington's most ornately embellished edifice, the Library of Congress, with Mr. and Mrs. Parsons. They rode the elevator to look down at the reading room, and he examined bronze busts around the rotunda. The library superintendent appeared and ordered the lights left on until Abdu'l-Baha finished his tour. Despite a relentless schedule, Abdu'l-Baha made time to go with Agnes Parsons to the Arlington National Cemetery to chant a prayer and place roses at her parents' grave. Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone, was captivated by Abdu'l-Baha and invited him to address the scientific society he served as president, where members shared their discoveries. Abdu'l-Baha spoke of the importance of science. Mahmoud notes,
"The hearts of those present were so moved that when the next member arose to give his talk, he could only say, 'The talk of the master from the East was so wonderful that I find myself inadequate to say anything,' and sat down."
Agnes Parsons arranged for the prominent English sculptor Theodore Spicer Simpson to sketch his likeness for a medallion.
Alexander Graham Bell's celebrated Wednesday evening was one of the intellectual high spots in Washington at this time. At one of those Wednesdays, I met Abdu'l-Baha. Later, Mrs. Agnes Parsons asked me to do a portrait medallion of him. But would he sit? Mrs. Parsons asked a number of her friends to her Washington home to greet the prophet. After the introductions, he took hold of my hand and led me to a sofa, where for a time we talked of aesthetics, particularly Persian art, for which I had a great admiration. Mrs. Parsons was convinced he would be willing to sit, and he was.
A second medallion was later designed by another well-known artist, Louis Potter. Although there are some discrepancies in the historical record, Mahmoud reports that former President Theodore Roosevelt came to see Abdu'l-Baha at Agnes Parsons' home, and they had a wonderful visit. An article published in the New York Tribune on January 20, 1912, reveals that Roosevelt knew about him before his visit.
He pronounced himself as wonderfully impressed with the teaching of Abdu'l-Baha, the Persian teacher of a universal religion expected in this country in May.
The influential artist and thespian Alice Pike Barney entertained society people and diplomats with her tableaux, interpretive dances, and musicals. One could say in her day she was the art scene of Washington, D.C. Alice had met Abdu'l-Baha when she accompanied her daughter Laura to Akka in 1905. Laura Barney would become known for her work translating Abdu'l-Baha's talks from notes she had written on pilgrimage. They would be published as Some Answered Questions. When Abdu'l-Baha came to Washington, Alice hosted a luncheon and 2 evening receptions at her studio. One reporter wrote,
"All yesterday afternoon, women in automobiles and carriages arrived for private conversations with the aged leader. Mrs. Nicholas Longworth, former President Roosevelt's daughter, seemed greatly interested."
Ali Kuli Khan, one of Abdu'l-Baha's secretaries in Akka, came to Washington, D.C. in 1901 to work for the Persian minister. In 1910, he was appointed Iran's chargé d'affaires. He was able to host receptions for Abdu'l-Baha and invite prominent diplomats to meet him. He obtained invitations for Abdu'l-Baha to visit the White House and to speak to the United States Congress, but scheduling did not work out. Khan's marriage to Florence Breed of Boston was the first Persian-American marriage among Baha'is and a symbol of East-West unity. Abdu'l-Baha was photographed with the Khan children, one of the numerous occasions in which he focused his attention on children. The Turkish ambassador, Dia Pasha, hosted a dinner for Abdu'l-Baha. He emphasized the unity between the East and West. When Abdu'l-Baha spoke at the Orient-Occident Unity Conference in Washington's Public Library, Mahmoud observed,
The hall was filled. As the master entered, the audience was awestruck. All stood and remained standing until he bade them be seated.
At the end of his talk, he said,
May this American democracy be the first nation to establish a foundation of international agreement, to proclaim the universality of mankind, to upraise the standard of the most great peace. Truly, this is a great and revered nation. Here, liberty has reached its highest degree. The intentions of its people are most praiseworthy. I will supplicate God for assistance in your behalf.
One reception for Abdu'l-Baha included Admiral Robert Peary, Mabel Thorpe Boardman, head of the American Red Cross, and Alexander Graham Bell. Admiral Peary was still being celebrated for his greatest feat, his 1909 expedition to reach the North Pole. Juliet Thompson remarked,
That day he looked like a blown-up balloon. Abdu'l-Baha spoke charmingly to him and congratulated him for his discovery, and then thanked him for discovering that nothing was to be found there, and so in relieving the public mind, he had rendered a great service. I shall never forget Peary's face. The balloon collapsed.
Louis G. Gregory, an African-American lawyer and descendant of slaves, became a Baha'i in Washington in 1909. Abdu'l-Baha encouraged him to
become the means whereby the white and colored people close their eyes to racial differences and behold the reality of humanity.
Gregory facilitated integrated meetings, though some opposed. In 1911, he went on pilgrimage to Akka, and Abdu'l-Baha encouraged him to confront racial divisions with love and patience. In Washington, D.C., Gregory arranged for him to speak at African American venues. He addressed the Bethel Literary and Historical Society at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church to a large mixed-race audience. At Rankin Chapel of Howard University, America's premier black university, Abdu'l-Baha proclaimed to over 1,600 faculty and students how the oneness of humanity transcends race.
Today I am most happy, for I see here a gathering of the servants of God. I see white and black sitting together. There are no whites and blacks before God. Strive jointly to make extraordinary progress and mix together completely.
He gave the diverse audience a new vision concerning the possibilities for unity and the advancement for people of color. Abdu'l-Baha then went to the Persian legation for a luncheon with some people prominent in the social and political life of Washington. Beforehand, Abdu'l-Baha asked Louis Gregory to meet with him at the legation, prolonging their talk until luncheon was announced. Washington was a thoroughly segregated city, where African Americans and whites did not dine together. When Abdu'l-Baha led the guests to the dining room, Gregory stayed behind, planning to slip away quietly. Abdu'l-Baha arranged the place of honor at his right for the African American lawyer, and then Khan hurried off to retrieve Gregory before he left the building. Once everyone had been seated, Abdu'l-Baha rose, stated he was very pleased to have Mr. Gregory there, and then, as if nothing unusual had happened, spoke on the oneness of humankind. Gregory himself later wrote that
Abdu'l-Baha made everyone feel perfectly at ease by his genial humor, wisdom, and outpouring of love.
Accompanying Abdu'l-Baha in his travels was British Baha'i Louisa Matthew. She and Louis Gregory had become friends while on pilgrimage the previous year. Louisa tells how Abdu'l-Baha gave her a white flower and told her to give it to Louis Gregory.
By looking at me in a peculiar way, he conveyed his meaning to me that he wished me to marry Mr. Gregory.
The Gregorys married and shared many years together. Washington Baha'i Pauline Hannon, though first shy with Black Americans, taught her washerwoman the faith. Then bravely, she and Joseph, her husband, held integrated meetings and became proponents of racial integration. At an interracial gathering at Joseph and Pauline Hannon's, he expressed joy at seeing the races together.
It is evident that excellence does not depend upon color. Character is the true criterion of humanity.
The Chicago Defender, the most influential African-American paper in the United States, printed a glowing report of Abdu'l-Baha's impact on the integration of the Washington Baha'i community.
His visit to Washington has been a triumphal march. He was the guest of one of Washington's wealthiest women, one who moves in the most exclusive social circles at the Capitol. And yet her house has been thrown open to rich and poor and black and white. Southern people whose hearts were once filled with the most bitter prejudices have publicly acknowledged their change of heart.